Scream was a gut punch when I saw it in the winter of '96. December was an unusual month to debut a horror film, but it didn't matter, as the film became a smash hit and single-handedly revitalized what was at that point a comatose horror genre. It successfully blended the mystery of a whodunit with the biting satire of black comedy and the ultraviolent slasher subgenre to create a wholly unique synthesis of ideas and stylistic choices, all brilliantly directed by the master of horror, Wes Craven, from a crackerjack script by an at the time unheard of Kevin Williamson, who shot to fame almost instantly. I had seen many horror films up to that point, but there was something different about Scream, and I was instantly smitten with how clever, fun, and stylish it was. Little did I know how much the film would stick with me over the years, and today I thought I'd do a deep dive into why I think Scream made such an impact on me and its many other fans. What better place to start than the opening sequence? Never has a slasher film started with such an emotional roller coaster of an opening. Williamson said he was inspired to write Scream, which was originally titled Scary Movie, after watching a news story about the real-life Gainesville Ripper, and, worried intruders might find an open window in the house he was staying in, decided to exorcise his fears into an 18-page outline. The opening is a treasure trove of fascinating ideas, and it's all held together by Drew Barrymore, who at the time was an eye-opening casting choice. Slashers were usually cast with unknowns or veterans of the genre, so Barrymore was kind of a left-field addition. The little girl from E.T. was all grown up, and even with her controversial past, was considered above the horror genre. It's obvious the filmmakers were going for the psycho angle. They needed a memorable death for the opening, and who better than someone people were certain the filmmakers would never just kill off in the first 5 minutes. And this brings me to the voice of the killer. Scream's phone call killer was inspired by 1979's When a Stranger Calls. And while the two films share a similar setup, the difference between the two callers is striking. While they're both aiming to terrorize the victim, they go about it in very different ways.
What do you want?
Your blood all over me.
What do you want?
To see what your insides look like.
Scream's killer is angrier, more acidic, his level of psychopathy much more amplified.
No, you listen, you little bitch. You hang up on me again, I'll cut you like a fish, understand?
It crystallized a concept that was often underdeveloped in slasher villains. The childlike, emotionally stunted psychopath who desperately wanted to be accepted, but would never join a club that would have them as a member.
What's the matter, Sidney? You look like you've seen a ghost.
Having the killer use a voice modulator is a pretty brilliant device, as it allows essentially anyone to take on the role. One of the reasons horror films are so popular is that they offer the maximum amount of catharsis for the audience. What greater catharsis is there than facing your fears and overcoming them? One only need to look to James Cameron's horror masterpiece Aliens to understand a glaringly simple fact of this popular genre. Cameron took the very simple entrails from Ridley Scott's first film and ran with it. The idea that the trauma from Ripley's experience with the creature was so devastatingly traumatic that the only way for her to be a viable candidate to lead the sequel was for her to overcome this crippling handicap. And thus, the movie perfectly encapsulated what the horror genre stands for in the first place. No wonder it's one of the most popular horror films. Kevin Williamson's acerbic wit and self-aware humor was a godsend to a genre that was on life support by the 90s. Williamson was someone who knew the horror genre well and loved it, but clearly had grown tired of its predictable machinations and wanted to toy with them, to let the audience in on the gag, and in the process, spin the genre into new territory. Almost every horror fan has been to a screening where someone in the audience yells at the characters on screen not to go down that dark hallway where the killer awaits. Williamson took those complaints and turned them into a new subgenre of his own making. The heightened intellectual prowess of the characters was a way for them to circumvent the killer's physical superiority. If they couldn't beat him physically, they could outsmart him and somehow escape his rage.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie.
Teenagers have always looked for ways of rising above their socially and physically diminished circumstances. And Williamson's hip, cool, and mentally razor-sharp characters did so by creating a reality for themselves that was deeply satisfying for young audiences at the turn of the century. I don't think it's a stretch to attribute some of Scream's meteoric success to this stylistic choice. Scream's self-awareness was something that was not totally new to the genre. Wes Craven's New Nightmare, released only 2 years prior, took a meta approach to the famous franchise. In Craven's experimental exercise, he essentially took the idea of the horror movie villain to its only logical conclusion. Such a force that was seemingly so immune to being destroyed that it could spawn a near endless number of sequels. Well, it only made sense to create a scenario in which Freddy Krueger could transcend the reality of the horror genre itself by crossing over into the real world, and terrorize the very actors and crew which worked so hard to bring him to life in the first place. This is the kind of mind-bending horror experimentation that probably attracted Craven to Williamson's script, and this kind of meta, self-referential Hall of Mirrors was brilliantly showcased by having Randy's speech itself played back in the news van for Gail and her cameraman. Us watching someone explain the rules of how to survive a horror movie, which is being watched by someone in the movie who doesn't know or understand these rules. It's an almost inverse callback to Craven's earlier New Nightmare, in which the characters are dealing with someone who shouldn't exist in the first place. Their world is one of absolute reality being violated by a force that doesn't belong there. In Scream, Williamson's conceit is that horror is a concept that can be understood and overcome if one has enough knowledge. In a sense, Craven's follow-up to New Nightmare is more optimistic. Scream was a movie that was as much about the anxieties of starting a whole new century as it was about the blood, bodies, and mayhem.
It's the millennium. Motives are incidental.
Our leaders couldn't be trusted, our heroes were a massive disappointment, and our institutions were morally bankrupt. The surreal mask of the killer is a wonderful externalization of the collective anxieties of the culture. The Edward Munch painting the mask was inspired by famously symbolized the anxiety of the human condition, the scream that is distorted in a kind of permanent horrified grimace of fear and revulsion. In effect, the killer acts as a kind of mirror to the characters and, by extension, the audience, forced to gaze into the abyss of their own misery and suffering. These kinds of ideas aren't something audiences are aware of consciously, but they act to enrich a movie's narrative. And the eerie ghost town paranoia, with its curfews and premature closings, even mirrors a certain crisis that's happening today. A crisis in which almost anyone could be the cause of death for the average citizen. Of course, an obvious parallel to Scream's own anyone could be out for blood and no one is safe plot point. One of Scream's thematic concerns was the passing away of good old American values.
You think you did it?
20 years ago, I would have said not a chance. But these kids today, damned if I know.
The older generation, with its predictably safe, reliably conservative way of life, had no place in Scream's hip, postmodern world. The murder of Principal Himbry acts as a definitive statement about the passing away of these old values in exchange for a more uncertain world. This new anxiety was exacerbated by the incredibly clever plot point of having two killers instead of one. Let's talk about the two-killer aspect, because it's not only awesome, but philosophically interesting. The split personality of Billy and Stu is on full display in this plot twist. Both killers are the typical emotionally stunted horror bad guys, but on opposite ends of the spectrum. Billy is the brooding heartthrob, committed to his girlfriend Sydney and sensitive to her needs, while Stu is the silly clown, uninterested in rules and social norms, in favor of a kind of controlled chaos. They even have different motives, one that makes sense.
Your slut mother was fucking my father. And she's the reason my mom moved out and abandoned me.
And one that doesn't.
Stu, what's your motive? Billy's got one, the police are on their way. What are you gonna tell them?
Peer pressure. I'm far too sensitive.
In this sense, the two killers represent both sides of the ethical quandary at the turn of the century. Stu's nihilistic rejection of sense-making, and Billy's firm emotional attachment to his egoic desires. And Scream was way ahead of the curve when it came to dealing with this psychological schism. The answer lied in destroying both ideas, as Stu is literally killed by a television set, the addiction of the nihilistic brain-dead zombie, while Billy is killed by a gun, something a lot more geared toward the aggressive, fatalistic emotional volatility Billy was known for. And then something extraordinary happens. Sydney, who lost her virginity in the previous moments, and as a result should be next on the chopping block, actually survives. Similarly, Randy, who should have been the prime suspect, turns out to be just another innocent. These reversals become the film's attempt at some kind of happy ending, in a genre that seemed in short supply, and it clued the audience into the fact that this was a new beginning for the horror genre. one that could become free from the constraints of the past. Scream is exactly the kind of movie that happens when talented writers and filmmakers have seen enough horror movies to begin to move past their predictable tropes and aim for something more. If you enjoyed this video, consider hitting the like and subscribe button, as I'll be posting more content in the future. Thanks for watching.